Welcome to the Policy Insights Forum and our Strategic Perspective series. Today's event is entitled Resetting the Canada-U.S. Relationship under President Biden. Our special guest is Lieutenant General retired the Honourable Andrew Leslie, and our moderator for the event today is Dr. Paul Taillon, Vice Chair of the Policy Insights Forum. I'm Goran, Pesic, Chair of the Policy Insights Forum and President and CEO of Samuel Associates. The Policy Insights Forum is a nonpartisan research division of Samuel Associates. The forum helps improve policy decision-making through research, analysis, and engagement. Samuel Associates is a trusted advisor to many influential businesses and organizations. The firm advises leaders on strategy, lobbying, and marketing across numerous industries and levels of government in Canada and abroad, and infrastructure development. And three, what is the strategic reset look like in Canada? Yesterday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and President Joe Biden met to reaffirm the special relationship, a commitment to work together on strengthening cooperation on issues of strategic importance. The reset has started. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge foreign government representatives and their respective ambassadors and political staff for participating in today's session. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the forum. Dr. Paul Taillon, I invite you to take the floor as the moderator of the event.
Thank you, Goran. As we know, President Biden took office in January with a lot of promises to keep, pledging to enact a spectrum of new policies that veer off those set by President Trump's administration. President Biden ran a substantive policy-based campaign and promulgated his ambitious plans that embrace large-scale economic and environmental initiatives to actions on healthcare, racial justice, and education. President Biden's agenda also centers on reversing or updating positions previously taken by the Trump administration, particularly on the issues of immigration and American foreign policy. President Biden's strategies to scientifically address the COVID-19 crisis and expedite the distribution of vaccines, albeit experiencing some obstacles, are well on track. The number of President Biden's plans is a challenge for his administration, and to successfully execute them in conjunction with his other initiatives. The immigration file has more than a dozen initiatives to be addressed within his 100 days timetable of taking office. This immigration initiative could prove most daunting to execute within the allotted time frame. As President Biden sorts through his wish list of which priorities to undertake, he faces a divided Congress. Moreover, the political dynamic of Washington could force President Biden to rein in some of his favored policy proposals, such as healthcare, the environment, and refocus on issues that may garner bipartisan support, providing COVID-19 relief and investing in improving American infrastructure. To comment on some of President Biden's goals for his presidency, Lieutenant General the Honourable Andrew Leslie has honored Policy Insights Forum to discuss some of these issues, in particular, the resetting of the Canada-U.S. relationship. General Leslie is uniquely placed to have this discussion, having been at senior levels of government and having been intimately involved with Canada-U.S. relations on a spectrum of defense and security issues throughout his military career, and more recently as a Liberal member of Parliament partaking in the strategically important and highly successful USMCA negotiations. Before we begin, I would like to provide an overview of our guest speaker. General Andrew Leslie has been a soldier, a business executive, and a parliamentarian. He has led at every level within the Army in domestic response, security operations, peacekeeping, and war. Between 2006 and 2010, he was the Army commander at the height of Canada's participation in Afghanistan, responsible for 57,000 people, their equipment, training, budgets, and related infrastructure. His missions include UN duties in Cyprus and various areas of the former Yugoslavia, and has served with the Canadian forces in Germany and in Afghanistan. After a successful career with the Canadian Army, he transitioned to become a senior vice president of a large Canadian corporation, working on network security with US and Canadian clients, and as a director on several corporate and charitable boards. Elected as a federal member of Parliament for Orleans in 2015, Andrew became the Chief Government Whip and a member of the Privy Council Office of Canada. In 2017, the Prime Minister asked him to focus on Canada-US relations, and he was a relevant cabinet committees member on international affairs and trade. He spent considerable time with North American business leaders, business associations, and opinion shapers over the course of the NAFTA-USMCA negotiations. Choosing not to run in the 2019 election, he now sits on several corporate boards, as well as a senior fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and the executive in residence at the Schulich School of Business. He consults on leadership, risk management, and governance. A graduate of numerous military courses on leadership, tactics, ethics, strategy, equipment acquisition, and weapons management, he holds degrees in economics, strategic studies, and military history, as well as executive courses from the Harvard Business School and the Rotman School of Management, as well as the Canadian Armed Forces Colleges. On that note, I will turn you over to our guest speaker, who will address the subject of this forum, the resetting of Canada-US relationships under President Biden. General Leslie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Goran. I'd like to set the scene, and I won't take too long to do it, but I'd like to present some big themes that I believe are equally applicable, although there will be differences in tone and tenor between Canada and the United States and with Canada and the United States. And the first, of course, is globalization. What does it mean in this context? Well, between the changes in Asia, the Pacific, parts of Latin America, and elsewhere, the multipolar global system has really started to emerge and form. And with the rise of China, India, Latin American nations, and other candidates, this leads to potential causes of friction. Power is finite. Whoever has some now in today's world, more often than not, either has to share or give up to see others succeed. And in this transition, whatever it may look like in its eventual state, we all have an interest in making sure it's peaceful, but conflict between the states, especially the major players in the future, can't be ruled out. So I think it's in all our interests to do all that we can to mitigate against such an event occurring for obvious reasons. Let's not forget the evolving and very complicated relative power of non-state actors, businesses, religious groups, multi-billionaires, criminal or terrorist networks who have an enormous amount of influence in a variety of specific niche areas. And of course, this leads to growing interdependence of, if you would, the new global order. Combine that with the potential vulnerabilities by being more interconnected. Interdependence can increase the risk and the impact of sophisticated cyber attacks, or, for example, a global pandemic. So who knew 3 years ago that the single most important issue facing all the national leaders is COVID, which is only amongst the very first of what could be a sweep of such over the next decade or so. The second one is demographic change. A variety of very smart folk and statisticians have figured out that roughly by the year 2050, and probably most of us listening or participating today will be gone, but our children won't be, the global population will be somewhere close to 9.2, 9.4 billion. And of this, only about 1.5 billion, 15, 17%, will live in what is defined today as a developed world. So the vast majority of the growth will occur in what we now economically see as marginalized countries. And of course, those young aspirants with access to new technologies, which will show them how other people are living, will probably legitimately want a slice of that which we have to improve the quality of life for their children. Another potential source of increasing friction. Persistent poverty and global inequality, already sort of alluded to in the previous comments, is, if anything, the gaps between the extraordinarily wealthy and the poor are growing larger. The good news is that the number overall of those who suffer the very worst of the poverty-stricken circumstances is diminishing as the world population increases, but this still means the total number has not gone down. And that in turn will lead to tensions and friction between the have and the have-nots. Climate change, I don't think I have to talk anymore about that, apart from saying it's real, is here, and those who deny it are not doing their citizens or themselves any favors. And I'm very glad to see recently the United States strategic documentation for the military forces has recognized the dangers of climate change. The resource crunch, where the developed nations want and need more, raw materials, sources of intellectual property, a whole host of other activities, but there's only so much to go around. And once again, as people with a longer term view seek to acquire the futures in such, be that in places like South America or Africa or elsewhere, that is constraining supplies and opportunities for those who also believe they will need it to acquire it over the course of the next decade or so. Once again, another possible source of tension. Science and technological change, something that all of you and I have lived with throughout the vast majority of our lives. That will not stop. If anything, the rate of scientific and technological change is increasing, which can displace what would traditionally be lifelong career jobs in a variety of industries to be replaced by much more effective, cost-effective systems, which in turn dump on society, if you would, the responsibility, quite rightly, for taking care of those citizens who no longer have a lifelong career so they can feed their families. And this can happen in technological countries or the more advanced just as quickly as elsewhere. And that bow wave looms on the horizon. And of course, attacks to governance. As strong men and women rise and adopt the populist tone, because it seems to work in certain portions of the world in terms of electoral victory, that leads to essentially the constant intent of getting your electoral base angry, because it's more or less proven that angry voters tend to vote more often than those who are relatively happy. Angry voters show up to vote not for something, but against something more often than not. And that rage directed towards international institutions who have traditionally been a convenient opponent or enemy, those who seek to acquire power through populist means and then to hang on to it at any cost, can lead to violence, can lead to further disruption, can lead to essentially questioning of not only international institutions, but national institutions, which attacks the credibility of the rule of law at a time when arguably we're all going to need it most. And there we are. So that's the scene. Good heavens. I hope I haven't depressed anybody. There is good news on the horizon. And I think the immediate point of good news is the election of Joe Biden. Because quite frankly, I think like a bunch of you, for good or bad, I have found the last 4.5 years of the Canada-US relationship and the US global relationship quite exhausting. And compounded with those determinants of change that I scampered through in relatively quick order, it leads to, this exhaustion leads to a certain degree of malaise. And you throw on top of that COVID and whatever comes next, and the economic impacts of COVID, the mental impacts, and of course the health consequences. The United States now crossing a grim threshold of 500,000 dead. The sense of worry, the sense of unease, the sense of frustration is growing, and as is the impact, the mental health impacts of isolation. And think of it as a pressure cooker with the lid firmly on due to safety, common sense safety restrictions, trying to deal with the pandemic. And it begs the question is what will happen once we start to come out of the dark, extraordinarily dark days of right now into hopefully a relatively more healthy future in the near term. President Biden, full disclosure, I've met him a couple of times when he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I think 2003 and 2008. My brief initial discussion with him, actually a second or third discussion, now that I think about it, I think he pointed out to me that he was one of the very few gentlemen or ladies who had led the Senate, U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee 3 times on 3 different occasions. And I think I seem to recall him saying there was 1 or 2 others but I can't remember their names. He, along with Vice President Harris, I think have struck exactly the right tone. They've made it clear where their priorities lie. And I thought the harbingers of what would unroll in their first 100 days was very well set when I watched and listened closely to the very good work that they and Chief of Staff and the other cabinet level at the time nominees did in terms of very discreet reach out, focused exclusively on the United States, because they all knew they had to provide a reassuring tone, a unifying tone to the extent possible. And I think his priority, which he's been laser focused on right from the beginning, of dealing with the pandemic and reestablish the United States on a sound health and economic footing as they look to the future, while focusing on the immediate impacts and trying to deal with that, was bang on and addressed the need amongst the electorate. Right after his election and the confirmation of a lot of his candidates for his cabinet, I must say I'm very impressed by the depth and breadth of the expertise that they all show, irregardless of which portfolio they have. They're all experts in their field. They appear to be unified by a common vision, and President Biden and the executive order process is certainly pounding a whole bunch of Army talk, pounding a whole bunch of good ideas downrange quickly to establish, if you would, the operating parameters of this team. I think combined with the sense of accountability and his knowledge and his team's knowledge of how Washington and the political systems work, and their expertise in their various portfolios, has had a calming influence, if you would, on the international view of the U.S. Senior leadership. And his record, President Biden's record of long-held public service, where he knows literally where most of the skeletons are buried. He knows how to get things done to the extent that is possible in such a partisan atmosphere. And his choice of cabinet colleagues, I think, will act as a reassuring vehicle for those who believe in respect for international credibility and the rule of law. I think that they're going to be united as a team, and they'll be looking at friends and allies through a lens of meaningful foreign policy, meaningful collective defense contributions and security apparatus, and reliable trade. Obviously united by this fierce desire to save lives and reestablish the economy on, building back better, quite frankly. Surrounded, if you would, by a green focus, taking into consideration those impacts of climate change, both now and in the near future. So let me now talk about opportunities and risks. To make a long story short, in terms of trade, I think the United States for the foreseeable future is going to remain heavily dependent on Canadian imports. And of course, our imports are ideally positioned as a preferred American source for cleaner energy, both hydro, nuclear, and for a while yet, hydrocarbons. But in terms of sharing in the production of automobiles and trucks, world-class agricultural and meat products, mining, high-tech and manufactured goods, green tech, services of all kinds, building materials, intellectual property, quality of life, tourism, all those things indicate that Canada and the United States' economic future are inextricably linked, but there will be changes. And President Biden has already made it clear that it was in his election platform, he meant it. And within the first day of him starting to assume his responsibility, he canceled the pipeline. He has made it clear that his Buy America policy means just that. So people might say, well, good heavens, that's going to have a dramatic negative impact on Canada. There's always two ways to look at these sorts of activities. I understand intellectually his aim and desire to show that he's serious about spending American tax dollars on American companies for the good of the American people. But he himself is an internationalist. And as well, let's not forget my opening remarks on trade. the interdependencies are such that you can't really untangle them. So there's opportunities there for Canadian business, dramatic opportunities, because Canadian businesses, by definition, are located far closer to their markets than just about anybody else. There's obviously exceptions in Mexico and one or two other nations that can get niche products to the United States quite quickly. But we share a commonality of standards, commonality of culture, commonality of language, commonality of geography, appreciation of distance, and as well, the links, the personal links between our two nations are so woven together. I'm a pretty good example. About 30% of my family are American. And that's a tough combo to overcome if you're an international competitor who is not Canadian. So there's opportunity there, and I'll explain more later on. Let me talk about something which, if you would, is something near and dear to my heart, and I think now more so than ever, near and dear to every national leader's heart around the world. Job one of any national leader is to protect their citizens, to make sure that they have all that the nation can provide them in terms of resources to better protect them from whatever the immediate threat might be. And COVID has shown what happens when you have leaders that are not absolutely focused on responding to the need and aren't prepared for the worst case scenario that might yet evolve. So I note, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, that the Prime Minister and the President had a variety of good discussions. The second item on the agenda was, after COVID, was, I believe, defense and security and the environment and trade, all four, but I believe there was significant portions of time given to defense and security, and I believe President Biden is looking for friends and allies who can contribute meaningfully to collective defense, and in this specific case, to the defense of North America, not only now, but against new threats that will emerge sometime over the next little while, as per sort of the big bullet points I read out at the beginning of my remarks. Delighted to entertain questions on that with you. I note that the time now is about 25 minutes since I first started speaking. I learned many, many years ago as a young soldier that generals at a certain point should shut up and listen, so I will do that. Thank you.
Thank you, General Leslie. We've received a few questions already. The first one comes about President Biden and his administration have inherited a very different world than when he was last in the White House just 4 years ago. China's predatory and coercive behavior under President Xi Jinping has increased rapidly in recent years, targeting against Uyghur Muslims, Hong Kong, Taiwan, India, Australia, Japan, Canada, and others. As a result, across Washington, there seems to be a consensus emerging that a more competitive whole-of-government approach towards China should be at the top of America's agenda. How will this affect Canada's position? And how can Canada, as America's closest ally, assist?
Based on his public comments, I believe President Biden and his team have identified that the region of the world which poses the greatest challenges and potential commercial rewards for the US is the Indo-Pacific. Same is probably true of Canada. And of course, you know that the region has a host of very complicated issues, a lot of which are linked: a burgeoning population, a keen appetite for resources, fast and lucrative markets, to the extent where, as you know, Canada has as its second largest trading partner, China. Climate change impacts, what does that mean? Growing disputes with an increasingly assertive series of nations, North Korea's dangerous behavior, the rise of populist leaders who are interested in retaining power at the expense of all else. Well, where do we go from here? How do we wend our way through essentially the established superpower, the United States, and the emergent superpower, China? One next door, lifelong, multicultural links that are actually difficult to understand unless you're born in North America. Another, second largest trading partner, China, and somewhere in between, an aspiring Canada, which always seeks to improve the quality of life of its citizens, has to balance the interests of the established rule of law and the established world order with those who wish to challenge the status quo. One of the reasons why it's so complicated right now, perhaps more so than most other times in history, is until very, very, very recently, the long-established champion of the international order, of the establishment of the international rule of law, of the arbiter, whether wanted or not, of a variety of disputes which no one else was willing or could solve, i.e. the United States, was, as its formal policy positions under former President Trump, attacking those same systems which essentially existed to temper international behavior. It's going to take President Biden and his team some time to reestablish credibility, though they've gone about it in exactly the right fashion. And in that 4 years, a variety of nexus, if you would, of alternate sources of power saw opportunity or received mixed signals. And here we are. And at a time when, of course, most of us we're all dealing with the international pandemic. We're all dealing with dramatic economic impacts of the pandemic, with diminutions in international trade flows, with the rule of the strong man emerging not only in other portions of the world, but in Europe, South America. It's a complicated time. There's opportunity in it there, though, for business folk, because new markets are being sought aggressively, and governments, including the Canadian government, I think is focused pretty hard on establishing new markets and exploiting, if you would, the vast bounty that Canada enjoys in terms of the high quality of finished products, the close relationship with the United States, and of course, natural resources to an extent which is almost unbelievable to other nations around the world, especially when you look at our relatively small population for the size of territory we have.
Thank you, General. Another question has come up. Understanding the context we face, what practical steps can Canada take to increase its influence in Washington?
Well, I had the privilege of helping to the extent that I could with the former NAFTA discussions, but my job was mainly to reach out at the governor level and at a variety of Senate and House committees and business leaders and try and understand their concerns. I'm talking mainly US, but a large number of Canadians. And I went to a variety of states, and I won't mention which states because that'd be unfair, but one of them ends in A and there's a north and a south. I got a chance to speak to a Rotary Club out of the state capital. And I was introduced as a retired general who'd fought in Afghanistan. Huge round of applause. I was fine then. I could do no wrong for about another 30 seconds. Then I was introduced as a liberal. And a liberal, I think, means something a little bit different down in that part of the world. And you could have heard a pin drop. So I went from being, by judging on the reaction, a fairly respectable fellow to not so much in a heartbeat. And the first 3 or 4 questions were, my son, John, went and fought in Iraq. Where were you? Where was Canada? We are currently deployed here. What resources are you contributing? I was an aircraft mechanic for squadrons that were on standby to launch nuclear strikes against Russia. What were you doing to help us? Now, it just turned out that I had been to Afghanistan and my son had hurt his back parachuting at Royal Military College and my daughter had fought in Afghanistan as a gunner. So I had ammo to fall back on in terms of trying to reestablish the connection. But I think a lot of Americans who probably didn't vote, a lot of them probably didn't vote for President Biden because President Biden said he's the president of all Americans, are getting increasingly concerned that the Americans have had to carry the collective defense burden essentially alone. And in that context, Canada has to do more. So yes, the president has come up, or virtually come up, and he's had his first interchange between the two cabinets. But I'm pretty convinced that the Americans expect Canada to do more to contribute to international peace and security. They do expect us to do more in terms of taking care of ourselves, in terms of pandemic preparations, in terms of assets to protect our shores alongside our American friends and allies. And in that context as well, he's probably looking for Canada to figure out innovative ways to allow him to achieve this pledge of America First in terms of spending federal tax dollars. There are solutions to that, I think, and I have a couple that I'd like to offer as a big idea. I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to wait for the more general question for you. So we have to, this is not business as usual with President Biden. President Biden, in my opinion, shares many of the sterling qualities of President Obama or President Bush or whoever your particular favorite might be. But he is very much his own person, and he is responding to the needs, the immediate needs of the American people. And about less than half, but it's still a huge number, are not necessarily happy with the way that the world has viewed or treated the United States in their point of view over the last couple of decades.
Thank you, General. There's a question that came in. Assuming a more contentious period of competition with China will last for several decades, would a joint Canada-U.S. policy on China be advantageous in resetting the position as America's closest ally?
Well, they're our closest ally, and I had the honor and privilege of fighting alongside American troops, and I worked for American generals and vice versa. I'm not sure that we want to actually have a 100% match because we are a sovereign nation. And we provide if you would, a useful interface between the various points of view that may exist and may cause strife, certainly tension. Canada's traditional role has been, of course, the United States is our closest friend and ally, but we're not an additional state. And so we have different, certainly there are differences in our culture. There are certain different viewpoints in terms of a variety of key policy issues, not the least of which is immigration. There are differences in terms of the environment, though those have diminished markedly over the course of the last couple of months. So having a 100% harmonized approach, I think, would do a disservice to Canada. And as well, I think it could be negating what is sometimes a differing voice from a friend. Don't forget, we tend to listen to our friends much more closely than others. You don't listen to your competitors or potential enemies nearly as much as you do your friends. And right now, for a host of reasons, the emergent superpower and the clash, if you would, the friction caused as it butts up against the power domains which have been exercised by the United States. In the absence or the diminution of the sharing of that power by nations such as Russia, which we can talk about in a couple of seconds, it's stressful times.
Do you think that yesterday's Canada-U.S. discussions will ensure funding for NORAD modernization and the renewal on the Canadian side of our interest in NORAD?
It had better. I think the President and Secretary of Defense General Austin, I knew him in Afghanistan. He was up in Bagram when I was in Kabul. I think we were a young 1 and 2 stars. Younger, anyways. It better. They're serious about friends and allies that can carry their weight. And NORAD is an entirely suitable instrument on which to essentially focus the efforts for security of the Canada-U.S. portion of the continent. And we have to pay our share willingly. And yes, social programs are expensive. Got it. And they're necessary. I understand that too. Let's not forget job one of any society, and that's to do what it can to protect its citizens. And those who thought perhaps 2, 3, 5 years ago that a superpower or international war was not possible, I believe, are mistaken. And the way to contribute to international peace, security, and stability is by all means encourage trade, encourage intellectual development, diffusion of technology, but as well, you have to have a certain deterrent value, and then you have to be prepared to back that deterrent value with judicious application of the worst case, which is the application of force or the threat of it. And we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to how we view our Department of National Defense and the resources that go into it. And by the way, how about the new threats? The ones you've already heard about, space, cyber, and the list goes on. Ooh, a pandemic.
The questions come up about NATO. What do you think of NATO's proposal to compensate troops and their contributing members? Does it risk fracturing the alliance?
Well, no. I mean, if you look at how many NATO troops are deployed out of the numbers that are serving under NATO flag, National Command, but NATO flag, it's a very small fraction. I think Canada has probably less than 800. I could be slightly off. I do know that we have less than 35 UN peacekeepers deployed on UN missions. This from a nation which prides itself as being one of the founding architects behind the whole UN peacekeeping idea. 35 peacekeepers, by the way, is about 1/2 of the average size school bus. So whether or not, quite frankly, I don't see it as a fracturing issue. If the less developed, less wealthy countries think it's important, then I would hope that Canada would continue to contribute to NATO, and I wouldn't see it as something that we should be proud of accepting. It'll get interesting though if the Americans say, well, okay, if you want NATO to pay, you can pay for the American troops as well. And that'll cause a whole bunch of people to rethink that problem, I think.
President Biden, when he took office, his slogan was to build back better. It was centered around handling the coronavirus, including the U.S. economy, and tackling systemic racism and economic inequality. These challenges seem to parallel Prime Minister Trudeau's aspirations. Should both nations be mutually supportive in addressing these similar objectives?
I think so. I think our cultures are closely enough aligned that there's a significant degree of overlap. But like we all know, we are not Americans and they are not Canadians. And there will always be differences between us, which continue to surprise those folk who don't pay a lot of attention to either respectively the US or Canada. I don't think they are important issues to deal with, especially now while we have the opportunity. And there's vast amounts of the public treasury that are flowing to such activities, both north and south of the border, indeed around the world. Once again, though, you have to view it from my perspective to the context of what makes sense, because to continue to spend is a very worthwhile objective, but you have to get a return on your investment, which is tangible. You have to as well figure out how you're going to pay for it should interest rates ever rise. Now we're getting into a different area. I don't want to attack or criticize the whole idea of building back better. It's only logical to do so. No one in their right mind would want to build back to the status quo, which led to the fragility and the risks that our citizens have been exposed to as a result of the pandemic.
The question comes along on Russia. While China's push for territory and influence is a long game, Russian aggression may provoke a more short-term response. Vladimir Putin has used chemical weapons to poison domestic opponents like Alexei Navalny, and even on foreign soil like Sergei and Yulia in the UK. This cyber army has repeatedly breached Canadian and US governments and private sector systems, most recently with the massive SolarWinds hack, government agencies and the private sector. With the last nuclear arms pact between the US and Russia expiring on the 5th of February, President Biden will face the immediate challenge of arms control with America's greatest nuclear competitor. Furthermore, Russian military forces and mercenaries have been involved in conflicts from Syria to Libya, the Central African Republic to Venezuela. What can Canada do to support American efforts in dealing with these mutual threats?
Yeah, it wasn't 5 short years ago that a variety of pundits were saying that great state war was no longer really possible or viable, and that international conflict was very much on the diminishing ebb, and that the respect for the rule of law and the establishment, now several decades old, of international bodies which regulated friction through cooperative or certainly relatively constructive, sometimes endlessly boring dialogue, would mitigate against the whole idea of really rapidly increasing tensions between superpowers or former superpowers. And guess what? Here we are. So that just points to the fact that human nature remains relatively constant. Power abhors vacuums, and those, mainly men, those strong men who seek to retain power by any means, do far more harm in the long term than they can even dream of in the short. So I think we can help by being a willing partner to contribute to international peace, security, or democratic development activities, to help those less fortunate than ourselves, to go where it doesn't make sense for the US to go if they're going to be put in a position of direct or potential direct confrontation between China, Russia, or other friction elements. And the last thing we want to do is create the circumstances where the Chinese, Russian, American are engaged in toe-to-toe face-offs. What concerns me far more than a global cataclysm organized by ruthless, cold leaders is the one that's generated by mistake. A mistake where, with weapon systems and the training of troops being such that they can respond so quickly, with such reach, with such aggression, and with such overwhelming impact in the target area that, before you blink, you can have literally tens of thousands very badly hurt or killed. And that in turn sets them forth a variety of steps which we've seen repeated throughout history. So I would say that Canada is ideally positioned to help the United States. And by doing so, we help ourselves. But we are not another state. So there are differences. And we have to champion those differences where they make sense to do so. We have to stand up for ourselves when it's required. And we also have to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact the US is our biggest market, our closest friend and ally, and they're right next door.
A question has appeared on USMCA. What, in your opinion, on the work with Mexico, Canada, and the US in terms of the USMCA commitments, especially in business and trade matters, what do you expect of the future?
Together, to use a trite phrase, together the three amigos have produced economic miracles. They've taken on the world in this integrated supply and management system in terms of producing mainly automobiles and many other things. Automobiles, or bits of them, and assembling them and increasing the standards of living of all those who've touched that process. Where the great friction point arises is that the benefits have not necessarily accrued proportionally to Mexico. And I think one of the great benefits of the last round of Canada, US, Mexico free trade talks was to ensure that more of the resources would flow to the people who actually did the work, not necessarily the managers and the factory owners. If we view this as a relatively integrated, or certain portions of the three nations as relatively integrated supply chain, and supply chain management issues can be brought to bear to try and address some of the remaining friction points, we can continue to offer world-class goods to the world. And all of us will prosper in turn. But it does mean that if you sell to others, there's an expectation that you're going to buy from them. And that's where a variety of special interest groups kick in amongst all three countries. As a matter of fact, just about every country in the world, because truly free trade is not 100% free in just about every case. Nations always have particular niches which can cause inordinate amounts of attention. The longest running trade dispute, which I'm aware of, is the Canada-US softwood lumber issue, which has been going on for a very long time. And I don't see any resolution on the horizon because Canada is convinced it's right and the United States is convinced that it's right, and both of them can't both be right. So every year, one or the other takes the other party to court, and here we are. That sort of issue magnified can lead to some of the circumstances which gave rise to some of the tensions in the last round, which happened about 2.5 years ago. Bottom line is the system works. Could it be better? Absolutely. Will there be more discussions concerning Canada, US, Mexico, and free trade? Yep. Will it change dramatically in the near future? No, I don't think it will. I don't think it will. The Buy America is a philosophical ideal, which, by the way, was first espoused by the Republicans way back when, adopted by the Democrats off and on, and President Biden it was first espoused by the Democrats way back when, and then grabbed onto by the Republicans. President Biden has made his intent very clear. He signed an executive order. There's ways for corporations, Canadian corporations, to, while retaining the U.S. as a client, to take advantage of that. And I look forward to the questions from the floor.
To some observers, the Trump administration gave the Biden team an incredible gift by drawing down American military forces and political engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq. Moreover, President Biden's team appears to have exact same policy that they want to undertake, and the Trump administration will now get all the blame for the obvious consequences of it. That the threat of Islamist terrorism is reemerging and in fact expanding. ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates are already taking advantage of the insecurity and chaos in Syria, northern Mozambique, the Philippines, and across the Sahel. The North African desert region that includes Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria. While Biden is likely to focus on great power rivalries or reconnecting with U.S. allies, the threat of terrorism remains potent. What initiatives or measures can Canada undertake to assist the Biden administration in addressing these challenges?
Well, Secretary Austin and his team are going to consult with allies as they figure out the next steps vis-a-vis the American military contributions for the defense of peace and security in Afghanistan. Let's not forget that Afghanistan has long been a source of international friction because of what happens inside its borders. It's also been seen as a prize going back to the time of Alexander the Great, and it's been the source of, if you would, the crossroads of empire and all the ensuing chaos, not attributable to the Afghan people per se, but geography, proximity, and to a certain degree, the aspirations of the tensions between a variety of ethnic groups in which there's surprisingly little common ground, even after several millennia of conflict. Afghanistan will unite to expel foreign intruders. They need economic development. They need a certain degree of peace and stability to achieve economic enhancement on that path to progress. They will, in my opinion, still need assistance, training, intelligence assets to give the Afghan government help, as they themselves are now carrying the lion's share of the burden of, or the duty of defending themselves. So we'll see what happens with the former President Trump's intent to pull out the remaining several thousand US troops from Afghanistan by a certain date. I suspect it probably won't go down to zero. I suspect there's still a need there. I suspect that the leading political authorities in Afghanistan are probably saying, oh, okay, no, come on, we're going to still need some help. Otherwise, all that investment you made in blood and treasure could be dissipated. I think, what do you think, Paul? Should we take a question or two from the audience?
This one, it comes from someone obviously interested in military business. As Canada embarks on modernizing its military to strengthen continental defense and NORAD modernization, do you believe that the US government under President Biden and American defense companies will pressure Canada more to buy more US-made military platforms and systems?
Well, any good business leader will probably try to use every established and lawful advantage they can to get whatever country to buy their thing. There's a bunch of cheerful competition now for a variety of big defense contracts that have been, quite frankly, languishing for far too long in the Canadian procurement system, be it fighter jets or ships. It is logical to assume that, especially when you look at the renewal of NORAD and the modernization of NORAD, so that's renewal of the agreement and the modernization of the technologies, not only which are the shooters, the aircraft, missiles, but also the lookers, the sophisticated systems that can detect the approach of threats, not the least of which is things up above, things down below, things on the surface, intelligence, and all that that means in terms of awareness of the Arctic, of the maritime approaches and domain, the air approaches. What does that mean? Who are the likely threats? It's going to be expensive. It's going to be, I think, breathtakingly expensive. And I would expect Canada to contribute its fair share, whatever that might mean. The flip side of that, if Canada contributes its fair share, then you would expect Canadian companies to have a proportional fair share of the responsibility for providing the technologies or integrating them, or call it what you will. And we will see how that pans out over the next little while. I've yet to see a coherent NATO modernization plan, and that's not a criticism because it's a complicated issue. And of course, they don't necessarily have not had the green light to have a sort of a public discussion about what they're looking for. But yes, I would expect Canadian companies to be able to compete and win a proportional share of whoever pays the final bill.
This is about US leadership. Credible US leadership within the international order is perhaps the best buffer to the global bad actors. What worries you most about the global bad actors and what they're doing in today's world?
So most of them are men. Most of them are grumpy, middle-aged or older men. And I worry that those grumpy, middle-aged older men, as they seek to retain power, knowing that the consequences of giving up power will result in them going to jail or worse, will literally fight to the death to retain power, which in turn, as the world gets more globally connected, could spur friends of those grumpy, middle-aged older men to come to their, quote, rescue, unquote, and thereby drawing in a superpower or an aspiring superpower or even an aggressive neighbor, which in turn could draw in others. And that's how wars start. It's one of many ways in which wars start. And its case studies of history are replete with many examples. And once the actual leader, the populist leader, has gotten it in his mind, mainly his, that I have to retain power because, first of all, I'm the only person that can see this country through to success. Oh, and deep down, I got to remember that if I ever get out of power, I'm in big trouble for all the bad things I did when I was in power. Then they're willing to spend their sons' lives and those of neighbors to keep that power. And that's always led to untold bloodshed. That's what I would worry about right now. Take a look around the world. Take a look who's been in office for a very, very long time. And just think of the seething frustrations of much younger generations, plural, who are frustrated with the sharing of wealth, with the perception of bias or the favoritism, and who are looking at these grumpy old men whose time has come and gone, and how far are they willing to go to try and get rid of them. The good news is that there are some extraordinarily accomplished older gentlemen who have the wisdom, the experience, the maturity, and the knowledge and passion to support the rule of law, to support transparency, to support a sense of decency or belief in both national and international institutions. And more power to them and the women that chose and choose to run for the highest offices in the land, in every country.
You mentioned earlier your big ideas regarding cooperation with the United States. Can you elaborate regarding NATO, USMCA, and COVID?
Well, COVID, it was sort of every nation for themselves, very disappointing. And both the United States and Canada did not get off to a quick start. In comparison to the relative shambles that we saw down in the United States last January, February, March, I think Canada was quieter, and the decentralized approach, I think, served us well. The flip side of that is, as the United States demonstrates extraordinarily impressive numbers in terms of vaccinations per day, which I believe now exceed the total number of Canada so far each day, then they have really spread their wings and soared. And we are still waiting for deliveries. So there is cooperation, but it's mainly viewing it as what did we learn and how can we get better set up for next time. So joint and integrated detection systems, which are mainly intelligence, not secret intelligence, but academic intelligence or people who have expertise in pandemics and in health. Sharing of information, viewing North America, much as we do in the eyes of NAFTA, as sort of an integrated production capability platforms. But let's make sure we have a couple of factories in Canada which can produce vaccines, please. The establishment of PPE and masks and a more comprehensive approach instead of every province or indeed nation being solely concerned about themselves, I think would enrich the availability of responses to make sure not so many people die for the next one. Expecting the United States to give out vaccines, which should be going in the arms of their citizens, to Canada, that's asking a bit much. Because if you don't have vaccines, your people will die. So expecting Americans to die to save Canadians, that would be a stretch too far. I don't see Canada as a nation being that comfortable with the flip side of that idea. Should we have been more fortunate to have had a whole bunch of vaccines readily available to us? But of course, it's still not a whole bunch. The Americans haven't vaccinated their population, even though they're doing remarkably well, as is the UK.
A question that comes from your early narrative. How do you view the impact of changing demographics in the United States, particularly those from Spanish-speaking countries, and the level of influence they may have on future trade relations?
Well, as the number of Spanish-speaking Americans grows, obviously their knowledge of the potential of what is south of the U.S. border, which doesn't only extend to Mexico, but I'm fully aware that Brazil doesn't speak Spanish, but rather Portuguese. But that knowledge can only help because there's markets that are available down there for what is produced by NAFTA. There are integrated systems which could be more effective and efficient should you have a broader range of locations where you can build stuff, because if you got to move stuff after it's built, that always incurs additional costs. And it's going to have an impact on American politics, just like a variety of cultural, demographic, and gender issues are having an impact on a whole bunch of other countries. And you can already see it today with President Biden's choice as vice president, who I think most people would say is a remarkable lady who has a Canadian connection. And I think it stands well. It bodes well for the United States that there'll be a diversity of views, different points of views, which hopefully the cumulative total of those views will make for better policy. I just want to get back to this idea of the Americans and what does it mean for us under President Biden. Look, the Americans, have they made mistakes in the past? Of course they have. So have we, lots of them. We and Canadians. But when the Americans really honestly feel themselves to be at risk, they're threatened, or that sense of right is attacked, or they decide to do something, boy, they can move. It's actually amazing to watch. And I've seen it both as a soldier, when it came time to deploy to Afghanistan, and the Americans just got it done. Tens of thousands of flights pouring into Kabul International Airport, Kandahar Airport, and the one at Bagram, and a couple others scattered around the country. Mainly American resources, or American aircraft carrying Canadian tanks and guns and troops. It was something to watch, just like it is with the vaccination response. So this has been federally organized just over the last couple of weeks, really, since the end of the election, by President Biden and his team, with the military inserted certain strategic points to give the backstop in terms of planning and capability should it be required. And this cheerful attitude of just get on with it. Just call back a whole bunch of retired doctors and nurses, have them, the vaccines distributed by mobile teams or at fire halls, and it's just astounding to watch.
What cooperative efforts do you see that Canada and the United States could do to secure our mutual interests in the Arctic?
Well, we have to pay a lot more attention to the Arctic. Remember how I said I believe President Biden and his team want partners that can contribute fully, and we lay claim, quite rightly, to sovereignty over a significant portion of the Arctic, and we have very little resources to show for it. China, over the last 10 years, has produced, I think it's 33 or 34 ice-breaking capable ships. Canada has produced none. We've got the Harry DeWolf offshore patrol vessels, but those aren't icebreakers per se. They have specialized units, both they and Russia, which train for the Arctic. We have great Canadian soldiers who have some experience in the Arctic, but they're not specialized. Sovereignty, in turn, means that you have to protect it. Obviously, you have to respect it, but you have to protect it. You have to have the resources capable of helping people should they need it, as well as dealing with disasters, both man-made or climatic. And if you look at the resources that we have dedicated to the North, they are minuscule. Absolutely, they're great people, don't get me wrong, but in terms of actual resources, so before we can become better integrated with the Americans, we have to build up our own capability. We have to build up our own so that we can integrate our emerging capabilities with what the Americans already have.
As China seeks to politically influence and shape trade opportunities with Central America and countries, do you believe the Biden administration will strengthen its relationship with Mexico and ask for Canada's support beyond the USMCA?
I'm not sure about that. There's no doubt that South America has burgeoning populations, and they have aspirations to, not surprisingly, quite rightly, to provide better resources for their families, to assist them in getting better education, which gives them better opportunities for their families in turn. So they're great markets. I think we can profit together. China has been seeking long-term contracts for a host of natural resources around the world, because they tend to plan in much longer horizons than just about every Western nation. There's nothing illegitimate, in my opinion, about that. It appears to be mainly a commercial enterprise. I think more and more people are starting to realize that if if you have long-term contracts for the production of copper or iron or whatever it may be, rare earths, then there is a strategic risk long-term to your nation, which begs the question, well, what are you doing to invest in similar sorts of capabilities or resources to ensure your long-term contracts? And the whole idea behind free markets, tempered by relatively agreed international standards and rules, is designed to stop those friction points from escalating into all-out conflict. What do we see? What do I see Canada? How do I see our role playing in that? We have stuff which other people want, not the least of which is the United States. We have a great workforce. We've got a very good supply chain that's mature. We have world-class agricultural and protein products, and most of our energy goes south. That's our largest export, which is the United States. No one's asked me what idea I have about taking advantage of the Buy America First idea.
On that note, what would be your ideas?
Did someone really ask it that quickly? All right, fine. It doesn't mean it's the right idea. It doesn't mean that it's the only idea. But let's assume that President Biden will follow through on his Buy America First, focused mainly on the instrument that he and his cabinet can control, which is the allocation of federal tax dollars. And there's also a valid assumption to be made that the various governors will want to keep the money that's coming in, or the capability that's coming into their state, to have a state stamp on it as well. So it could be Buy America First and then Buy Minnesota First, with some combinations there too. Yet, in my introductory remarks, I reminded all of us, I think, that we are the natural source of so much for the United States to buy, both in terms of finished goods, skills and services, venues for travel, raw materials, and foodstuffs, and the list goes on. And of course, we're blessed with geography. We're blessed with a detailed knowledge of the American markets, especially Canadian business folk, because of course they spend a lot more time looking at the US than the US does looking at Canada. So you can see a scenario evolving where more and more Canadians, to increase their market share or to maintain that which they have now, will make further investments into corporate structures and governance, which can best respond to the Buy America First by, instead of essentially passively selling their stuff to an American reseller, they can get more and more involved in setting up, if you would, twinning, in setting up joint ventures, in setting up mechanisms which will allow them to achieve success and increase efficiency in terms of their sales down in the US, which in turn would and might encourage other international sellers to the US, or buyers, but mainly sellers, to partner with the Canadian firms that have such strong connectivity and sort of these governance models that would meet the requirement of the American law down in the US. And that could position us extraordinarily well. And essentially it could be a new line of business, if you would, which applies across all the lines of export we currently have. Not sure what the details are yet, just something to think about.
President Biden's rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline was not a surprise. How do we recover?
I thought it was a good lesson for all of us. He talked about it repeatedly. He was challenged about it and on it in a variety of talk shows. His political opponent attacked him on it, didn't budge in it. And despite Canada being closest friend and ally, and largest trading partner, and largest exporter, Canada's the largest exporter of energy to the United States, and it's our largest export, no hesitation, done. So I think it was a bit of a wake-up call. Pay attention to what he says. He's serious about those things. And he can move a lot faster than his predecessor did. And as well, he comes from a policy background which is not recent. These are long-held ideas based on a whole bunch of inputs, ranging from political, economic, social, environmental, and the list goes on. And these decisions are not made lightly, and his cabinet appears to be completely unified with the series of executive orders that are being kicked out at an astonishing rate. By kicked out, I mean signed into effect, which gives you a very good indication of where he is going. That pipeline, as far as I'm concerned, is done. It's dead. It's finished. People will be chagrined to hear that, but they've already heard it. The President of the United States, with not a single deferring voice from his cabinet or senior leaders, has made the decision. And it's time to move on. It's time for us to invest in greener technologies, much more so than we've done in the past. It's time for us to figure out, how do we make our existing export of hydrocarbons to the United States cleaner? Are there technologies which we could, Canadian technologies, which we could give just a little bit more money to, so they could come up with a better idea? Oh, there's no better ideas, critics will say. Sure there are. There always are. Will it be slightly more expensive when you amortize the cost of that technological investment? Of course it will be. But it'll still be cheaper for the United States to import slightly more expensive and cleaner Canadian hydrocarbons than stuff that is filthy from further away. Because I suspect President Biden is going to have a low tolerance level for really dirty oils that are still some imports that go into the United States. Not from Canada, but from elsewhere.
General, how do we handle China's seemingly overbearing strategic interest in the Arctic as a, quote, near Arctic country, unquote?
Well, I'm not sure that I accept, it's free speech, that I'm going to nod to the nuance of that question. I had the privilege of representing the government of Canada in China at an Arctic conference in 2019. And that's when a time when Canadian officials weren't really encouraged to go, but they have a greater tolerance for ex-generals, I guess. I'm not naive. I saw a nation which was keenly aware of the emerging strategic value of the Arctic. I saw a nation which was willing to dedicate resources to assist in freedom of movement or exploration, or to challenge those who might wish to increase the size of their current territorial boundaries in the Arctic. I saw a nation which was busy building icebreakers at a brisk rate of knots, if I can mix maybe analogies. The United States is our closest friend and ally. I've already mentioned this. I don't want to be boring. I fought alongside Americans. I like Americans. They will always be our friend and ally. And yes, temperatures may wax and wane between Parliament Hill and the White House, but we are going to be there alongside our American friends in the Arctic for the foreseeable future, and that's a long way away. The big danger is the impact on the environment and the seaboards with the melting ice. And it doesn't really take too much of a naysayer to become convinced when you start to read the climactic reports on rates of melting and the impact on the air corridors. Sorry, not the air corridors, the airstreams, and of course, the jet streams, and as well the streams of differing temperatures in the Arctic waters down to, anyways, all that. We're going to be together, Canada and the US, in the Arctic for a while, and there will be challenges, just like there are challenges from Russia, who's busy doing, guess what? Building Arctic bases, building icebreakers, building capability to impose or to try to impose their will on what they perceive to be the extension of the ice shelf into their claimed lands. It's going to be a place of increasing strategic interest and some tension.
It seems that we need to address a comprehensive cyber program between Canada and the United States. How would we do that?
Well, I used to run the highly classified information technology systems in the Canadian Forces. I actually, let me rephrase that. I used to be the young one-star responsible for them, but no one in their right mind would ever, give me the ability to run, or the responsibility to run such systems. It's way beyond my technological level. The integration at the military level, between our two nations, Canada and the United States, is remarkable in terms of defense of key national defense assets. Where there's still enormous vulnerabilities is in the two corporate cultures. There's more than two cultures at work, but in between the two business worlds and personal worlds of our two nations. So I think first and foremost, we in Canada have to get much more serious about cyber security, not only in terms of defending our government institutions, but our chartered banks, our medical record systems, on insurance, on banking, and the list goes on and on forever. And I've yet to see any progressive thought that's been implemented vis-a-vis a national cybersecurity strategy, which is more than talk. And I've yet to see any significant amount of resources poured into or directed towards cyber defense and, trusting in the goodwill of a variety of Canadian corporations to make voluntary contributions to centralized bodies which put forward thought papers. Great start. The start has been starting now for about close to a decade and a half. So I think it's time we actually got serious about cyber defense. And the military has specific roles in cyber defense and other activities. And I'm pretty confident that D&D and DOD are miles ahead of just about everybody else. So they are not per se the worry. The worry is the rest of us, and we could be doing a lot more. So we've got NAFTA, but we don't have a NAFTA-like approach to protecting intellectual property and the flow of information.
The COVID situation, nationally as well as globally, have basically reinforced the importance of public safety, as well as the importance of maintaining a supply of PP&E. In your view, has this been a success or a failure on global terms in dealing with an epidemic that we knew of some type, an epidemic of some type was going to happen?
Yeah. It's always both dangerous and tempting to become an armchair general and to criticize those who are actually stuck into the fight and trying to do the best they can to protect their citizens, be they American, Canadian, or elsewhere. I think that the first thing that we've got to do is solve the immediate problem, which is getting vaccination jabs into people's arms. And having lots of vaccines arriving months from now doesn't do nearly as much good as slightly more arriving today. Because there will come a point when Canadians look around and see other nations who are essentially all vaccinated, or whoever wants to be vaccinated, and their death rate will go down, whereas ours will remain at least steady and maybe even climb a bit with a third wave. One of the big issues is there's a reluctance by all governments, in my mind, or almost all, to do a blunt after-action review of what went right and what went wrong, because they're worried about political consequences, so they tend to try and muzzle or deflect or obfuscate or spin or whatever. That is going to get in the way of progress, and there will be a next time. The good news is everyone can see what's going on now. Doesn't matter where you live, you can form your own opinion about how your national leader, no matter what your nationality, how is your national leader doing in guiding your country through this stage of the pandemic. And you better pay attention, because the odds are high that in your lifetime there'll be another one, and the last thing you want to do is start again from square one. Anybody who's foolish enough not to have ventilators on hand, lots of PPE, and a vaccination production facility within their own territorial boundaries, and a more centralized and focused regional and national response to pandemics will be in big trouble, not only in terms of moral authority, but also in terms of the response from the electorate, will probably be quite ferocious should this ever occur again. But I think Canadians, by and large, as is true of a lot of Americans, I suspect, tend to rally around their national leaders, both at municipal, state or provincial and federal level in times of crisis. And they can understand that it's tough and maybe it could have been better here or faster there. But I think most are still willing to give their leaders a chance. The third wave, if it is with the variants, if that does get even more vicious than projected, then I think there'll be some surprises.
General, the last question: how can Canada maximize its influence in NATO?
Do more. Really easy. Do more. There was a time when we had several thousand troops deployed in the Balkans, and at the same time we had 3,000 troops in Afghanistan. We had about 2 or 3 ships companies worth of sailors deployed doing anti-piracy patrols or standing naval forces Atlantic, and we had a whole bunch of mainly old Hercules and Polaris jets transporting troops and providing. Anyways, do more. We're a blessed country. We are unhesitating in spending billions on social programs. Got it. But collective defense means that you've got to contribute more. And for people who say we punch above our weight, give me a break. Everyone says that. It's now, that's a meaningless statement to me. I think our American colleagues are saying, so what exactly do you do? Oh, by the way, the stuff that we are doing, we're doing very, very well. And the troops are not the issue. Do more. You want to contribute to international peace and security? There's great ideas out there, wonderful. There's thought papers, there's conferences you can go to. Do more. Put boots on the ground. And that's not the only criteria of success. I got that. But it really helps.
On that note, General Leslie, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Policy Insights Forum. Your opinions and insights have been most informative and useful for our audience. We look forward to seeing you soon in the near future. Thank you again.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Steve.